Welcome to the very first episode of Numbers Game. I'm Cynthia Frelund, and it means a whole lot to me that you're choosing to spend some of your time and energy with me. I'm so excited to get started, but I fully admit that I expect this thing to evolve and change over the coming weeks, months, maybe even longer. So thank you for being here from day one and growing this thing into something very cool together. My plan to start is to give you the NFL data and strategy and context that you're used to, like I do across NFL media. But I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to take you under the hood of my model. I want to be your analytics department. I built my models with the input of real coaches, players, and front office execs, and then I vetted it with a bunch of PhDs, so relevant quants, people who actually know statistics and math so well, better than I could ever. So in other words, let me do this heavy lifting for you, and we'll go on the journey of figuring out why together. I love the data of sports, and I want to explore and share findings with you. I want to be a source of exceptional information, but above all, have a ton of fun and just be a very happy moment. During the NFL season, we'll cover every game and give some facts and figures to show why things are likely or not to happen. We'll sprinkle in some college football where we can too, especially as we get closer to draft season. And I love all of the major events on the sports calendar, so we will weave them in. March Madness, NBA, like you name it, we're there. In golf, horse racing, like literally all of it. And if you don't think I love hockey, I have a dog named Gordy. We're all good here. It's going to evolve, and hopefully we can grow this into something pretty cool. So thank you so much. I appreciate your feedback in advance. And I'm already breaking my own rule because we only get one chance to take a holistic view of the NFL, and that's before the season starts. So I promise I will post all of my week one scores and a bunch of fantasy helpers. So projection for particular players, probably go at least 20 deep for wide receivers and running backs, and it'll be helpful. So I'll post all of that on my socials, but this time we're going to take a holistic view of the entire NFL, and I'm going to do it very quickly. So if you want to go even deeper, you can go on NFL.com/Frelund. I did a win total article on every single team. So if I didn't get enough on your team, you can get a little bit more there. Oh, and I forgot to mention one thing. I'm going to try to do all of this in 30 minutes or less. Maybe this week I'll go a little bit over, but I'm really going to try. So let's start the season off where last season ended, and that's in the AFC West with your back-to-back world champion Kansas City Chiefs, who yet again have the highest win total in all of the NFL at 11.4 in my model. If that sounds low, it's not. Everything should be closer to 8.5 this early on in the season. There's a lot of parity in football. My favorite note on the Chiefs is the fact that they are in the one and only bye in 16.9% of my simulations. I run 1 million per game, so that's 272 million for the regular season, and they get it in 17% of those simulations. For context, usually it's around 10% for any team in the beginning of the season or this early on. That is a significant uptick. They have a favorable schedule, and it doesn't hurt that they have Patrick Mahomes as well. I also need to point out my favorite next-gen stats note here, which is that between 2018 and 2021, Patrick Mahomes threw 44 deep touchdown passes, so 20-plus air yard touchdown passes. That ranked second most over that time period, and he's only thrown 2 since. So that's 2 since 2022. However, we saw Xavier Worthy run a insanely fast 24.41 mile per hour 40, setting a record. So maybe this means the return of more deep passes for Mahomes, or more likely that teams will absolutely never give them any single high looks. Maybe one of the two things. However, Patrick Mahomes tops all quarterbacks in terms of passing touchdowns at 34 in my model, and he earns more than 32 in 58% of simulations. The Los Angeles Chargers come in second in the West for me with 8 wins, which is a slightly less exciting projection than some have for them. For me, the biggest source of change, area of growth for them, will be in the run game, where next-gen stats show that last year they ranked in the bottom 5 in the NFL in terms of yards per rush, yards before contact per rush, rushing yards over expected, rushing success rate, and rushing EPA on designed runs. So between bringing in Jim Harbaugh, who has a clear track record of wanting to run the air out of the football, Greg Roman, left tackle Joe Alt in the draft, and also changing their entire running back room, this forecasts to be an area of success for the Chargers. The Denver Broncos come in third in the AFC West with 6.4 wins. And I love my Bo Nix projection because he projects to throw for more than 3,015 yards this season, which is an average of just over 177 yards per game in 59% of my simulations. Also, the defense ranked 30th against the run last year. And I mean, first of all, you got to take out that one specific game against the Dolphins. But in general, they really addressed that. And they rank in the 16-17 region for me right now in my preseason computer vision rankings. The Las Vegas Raiders, with 5.7 wins, round out the AFC West for me. And I want to point out one thing that gets overlooked, we do not talk about enough, and that is just how good Max Crosby is when stopping runners. In terms of edge rushers, no one had a better EPA, so it actually is negative when a defender has a good EPA, so negative 8.7 against the run means opposing offenses, their point potential went down 8.7 points when they ran anywhere near Max Crosby, which was the best among any edge defender. To recap the West, Kansas City wins the division yet again and gets the bye in nearly 17% of simulations. Now, I need to point this out because it's insane. There are kids that are going to their first day of third grade this week that have never lived in a world where the Chiefs aren't AFC West champs and winning at least 10 games. And next year, there will be fourth graders that are able to say the same thing. Now let's move on to the AFC South, which is the other AFC division that is most likely to send only one team to the postseason. Let's start with the Houston Texans, who forecast to have 10.4 wins in my model. CJ Stroud throws for over 4,200 yards in 63.5% of simulations. He's my projected passing leader for the season at over 4,600 yards. By the way, he threw over 4,100 last season as a rookie, and there's a lot of areas in which they improved, but I definitely think they're still going to need to pass. In other words, they're not going to be in situations where he's passing to save his life. It's just a very efficient passing metric for Stroud. The Jacksonville Jaguars forecast for 8.3 wins, good for second in the division. The interesting thing here is that Travis Etienne forecasts for at least 925 rushing yards in 58% of simulations. I know I'm giving you kind of seemingly small numbers like 58, 59%, but I'm a conservative modeler, so I have to go back through and look through my model and tell you where the thresholds are. There's a distinct threshold at 58%, and that's where things become more certain. So Travis Etienne over to 925 rushing yards. Then there's the Colts. So the model spits out 8.1 wins as their median projection. They have a high ceiling and a low floor. They go as their quarterback goes. If Anthony Richardson goes out there and lights up the world, that number could be considerably higher. It could easily surpass the Jags. We could be looking at well into the playoff territory. However, the model also says that if things go poorly, it could go very poorly. So boom or bust is a little bit more of the theme around the Colts. And I want to point out something really cool about their defense. In 2023, they had the 5th most sacks in the NFL, but they have 4 players with 8 or more sacks, most in the NFL. They returned all 4 of those players this season, and then they added Laiatu Latu out of UCLA at pick number 15 in the draft. He was actually the first defensive player taken in the draft. And by the way, in 12 games last season, he had 13 sacks, 10 quarterback hits, and led FBS with 21.5 tackles for loss. Pretty darn good, pretty good. Oh, by the way, 5th in FBS in pressures per PFF. The Titans round out the division with 6.2 wins. The one thing I want to point out here is the area I think will change the most. You got a guy named Bill Callahan there, and this man is a legend, especially when it comes to really figuring out how to make O-lines work. Last season, Titans passers faced pressure in under 2.5 seconds, so those are considered quick pressures per NGS, on 19.7% of their dropbacks. That's the 3rd highest rate in the league. That's a problem. If you're getting pressured and you're getting pressured fast, it just doesn't really give your quarterback a chance. And especially when you have a new young quarterback, that makes things even worse. So that's an area where I expect Bill Callahan to come in there and make things considerably better. And it's not just going to be an effect this year. It's also going to be going forward. So Titans fans, it's going to be okay. This is going to be a year where the O-line gets better and better. To recap the South, the Houston Texans win in over 44% of my simulations, and the model is pretty mean. As in, of the 8 teams we've looked at, only 2 of them have had rosier outlooks than other people forecast for them. The math says the AFC East is the most interesting division in football, And of course, that means that there's a lot of nuance to what's going on. So let's start with the actual numbers. First, we have the Jets at 10.3 wins. They're forecast to win the division. And I want to point out that Garrett Wilson sees the end zone at least 7.5. So let's round that up to 8. He sees the end zone at least 8 times in 59% of simulations. That's an interesting one. Now, as for the Buffalo Bills, they project at 10.08 wins. That's why I had to go 2 decimal places, because it is razor thin with those margins. The Buffalo Bills have a really interesting projection because losing the spine of their defense, so they have Matt Milano is probably not going to be back until late in the season. And of course, both of their dynamic safeties are no longer there in Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer. So that actually makes a little bit more volatility for them than we've seen in recent years. However, I'm not worried about Josh Allen. Josh Allen forecasts to reach the end zone with his feet more than any other quarterback for me at 9 rushing touchdowns at least. So 9 or more rushing touchdowns for Josh Allen and the Bills. And last but not least, in this little 10 cluster here, technically third in the AFC East, which sounds crazy, are the Miami Dolphins at 10 wins. The interesting thing about the Dolphins is this really fun fact about Tua. We all know he gets the ball out really quickly, the fastest in the NFL, 2.36 seconds. But did you know that he targeted the intermediate level of the field at the 4th highest rate? So my point here is that despite these quick passes, they weren't all necessarily short passes. They were also deeper passes. So there's something going on with this scheme that's very special. If the Dolphins can overcome some of the losses that they have on defense, Christian Wilkins, etc., then that could be a path for them to surpass both the Bills and the Jets, or even just one of them. And last but not least in the East, it is the Patriots at 4.7 wins. One thing I love about the opportunity to reload at the Patriots is to take a look at some people who I maybe didn't know as much about. So this last offseason, off-ball linebackers were something I was really into. So Juwan Bentley, he jumps off the page. I got to give him his flowers here because last season, he was tied for the most sacks on the team at 4.5 and led the team in tackles at 114. He calls the signals on the field for the defense and plays all 3 downs. So he's my unsung hero on the Patriots who we need to be talking about more. Now, here's an interesting fact, right? 3 teams with 10 wins in a division feels like, when's that going to happen? It happened last year in the NFC North, which I'll get to in a second. The East has the most different outcomes at the top, meaning of those 3 teams, the way that they finish is the most different from any other division, which means that right now the Jets only win the division in 22.7% of outcomes. So that's not very different from either the Bills or the Dolphins. My model says that the AFC North is the most difficult division in football this season, and I have the Baltimore Ravens coming out on top yet again. I have 10.5 wins forecast for them, and I really want to focus here on one specific number, and that is the rushing yard total for Lamar Jackson. I know Derrick Henry is there, but Lamar Jackson's legs, they don't care. I have him forecast for over 900 rushing yards this season, and he goes over 700 in 63.3% of simulations. That is a lot. Also, just for fun, one of the next-gen stats that I really love is rushing yards over expected. So how many were expected and how many more did they get? Well, he leads the league with 1,768, which is a full 399 more than the next closest guy, which happens to be a running back, Nick Chubb. Now, the Bengals, they end up in the number 2 slot in the North for me at 10.4 wins. This division really came down to strength of schedule. And remember, the Bengals are playing that 4th place schedule. They also retooled the middle of their defense. They got Sheldon Rankins, DJ Reader, he departed for Detroit. They brought back Von Bell and got Geno Stone. The win share added was as if they added 1 full starting wide receiver. So hopefully that wide receiver who's not starting holding in actually is playing, because that would be a really nice uptick for them. And by the way, the projections all include a full season of Jamar Chase. At number 3, the Cleveland Browns. They forecast for 8.7 wins in my model, and I want to talk about Amari Cooper, who earned 629 receiving yards on vertical routes last season. So that's post, corner, go, and wheel. And that was tied with CeeDee Lamb for the second most, and only Tyreek Hill had more, and he was at like 1,129. So let's not sleep on Amari Cooper's ability to absolutely stretch the field and change the passing quotient. And last but certainly not least, the Steelers at 8.6 wins, which means Mike Tomlin is very likely to extend his streak of never having a losing season. 8.6 very easily rounds up to 9. I don't like their O-line. My model ranks it in the bottom 6 in the NFL ahead of the season. And even a quarterback who has done all the things that Russell Wilson has cannot necessarily overcome this for too long, especially in such a ferocious division. So to recap, the Ravens win the division, then the Bengals make the postseason as a wild card, and 3 teams, they end up making it in only about 7% of simulations. However, you're saying there's still a chance, and it's most likely the Browns. The AFC recap and projected order I have is Kansas City with the bye, then Baltimore, Houston, New York, Cincinnati, Buffalo, and Miami. Moving on to the NFC. Let's start again in the South, where I have the Atlanta Falcons winning the division at 10.1 wins. Adding Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons in basically 24 hours shifted their win projection up 0.2 wins, which is pretty massive. Also, it shifted Bijan Robinson's projection up. He reaches the end zone at least 7 times on the ground, so rushing touchdowns, at least 7 in 61% of simulations. That went up. That used to be around 55, now it's 61%. Moving on to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at 7.9 wins. Mike Evans feels extremely underrated to me, and I think we have to give him his flowers. Meaning, I think we see him see the end zone at least 9 times this season. He ranks number 5, so tied for number 5 in terms of receiving touchdown leaders for the year. 9 touchdowns happens in at least 58% of simulations. The New Orleans Saints end up with 7.4 wins, and Chris Olave, I feel like we haven't talked enough about this guy. I have him forecast for at least 1,200 receiving yards. So if you're, let's bring that number down. Cynthia, how many times in the model does he go over 1,050 yards? And the answer is 59.5%. So let's round that up to 60% of the time. And last but not least, let's talk about the Carolina Panthers at 4.9 wins. I want to talk about Robert Hunt for a minute because last season as a Miami Dolphin, he was insane. PFF shows that he allowed just 5 pressures. That's the second fewest of any guard in the NFL. And he surrendered the lowest pressure rate, so 1.3%. And I know the Dolphins, they got the ball out really fast, but I think that this is a really hopeful and great metric to point to, that the Panthers went out there and got a guy who could really protect their young quarterback so he can develop. So to recap, the Falcons win the division. And I know, Tampa Bay fans, you're going to be mad. I know that you won 3 times in a row, but I think it's now time for the Falcons to take the crown. And by the way, this year, the AFC West is one of the weird, non-normal opponents for the NFC South, so that also makes things more difficult. Moving on to the NFC West, where I have the San Francisco 49ers atop the division with 11 wins. We got to give some love to Trent Williams. I mean, his pocketbook is just fine, but this man is worth every penny. In fact, last season alone, he had a top-tier, top 4 pressure rate allowed at just 7.2% of his pass blocking snaps resulted in a pressure. So 4th lowest among 34 qualified left tackles. There's so many ways that I could talk about how great he is in the run game, in the pass, but look at what happened with Brock Purdy and this amazing season he had last year. Remember, he led all qualified passers in passer rating, yards per attempt, passing EPA, and success rate per next-gen stats. Not to say it's all on the O-line, but it's the way everything works together. And now that they've got this massive, literal massive piece back in order, things are looking great for the Niners. Moving on to the Rams at 8.9 wins. When I look at this Rams team, I am very grateful that we got to see Aaron Donald last season, and I kind of feel like we might be looking at something similar with Matthew Stafford this season. So I need to tell you about the metric I created just because of him. Remember, he was a Lion. He didn't have good O-lines then. But it is what happens on the down after being pressured. No quarterback over the past 12 seasons is better than Matthew Stafford in this metric. In fact, he has over a 101 passer rating on the play after being pressured. What happens? Turns out Matthew Stafford, he's not fazed. The Seattle Seahawks forecast for 8.5 wins, which is decently rosy compared to some other people. When I'm looking at this team, Geno Smith, especially against zone defense, really sticks out. In fact, he completed over half of his passes, and only 5 quarterbacks last season managed to do that. So Geno and this run game, combined with a lot of new thought, new head coach, new offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, new head coach, Mike McDonald, it's all going to work together in a way that is different from maybe what we saw before. So I love Geno's adaptability and the fact that he's very good against zone defense. The Arizona Cardinals at 7 wins round out the division. I want to talk about Kyler Murray here for a second, especially his running ability. He only played 8 games last season, and next-gen stats show that the Cardinals offense gained 224 rushing yards over expected on designed runs, so they ended up ranking 5th out of any offense in the entire league on such runs. So these designed runs, as well as designed runs for running backs, so both the quarterback and the running back designed runs, those will help as rookie Marvin Harrison Jr. gets acclimated to the NFL. The run game will be a very big source of positivity going forward. To recap the division, the 49ers come out on top, and they are actually on top of the entire NFC per my model. Remember how we didn't know if the 49ers would have Brandon Ayuk and Trent Williams? Doesn't that feel like so long ago? Just kidding. That was fun. Moving on to the North, where the Detroit Lions at 10.7 wins forecast to win the division. Yikes. I don't think I've ever anyway, I can tell you for sure I've never forecast that before. Pretty fun. Next Gen Stats shows that Jared Goff had the best touchdown to interception ratio, 31-4, and second highest passer rating, 116.8, when not pressured in 2023, meaning the O-line did their job. And good news, guess who ranks number 1 in O-line again this year, not just in my model, but also in PFF's? That's right, the Lions. I love this. This is exciting. I'm now very nervous, and we won't be talking about it anymore. Just kidding, I'll talk about it every week. Next, the Green Bay Packers at 9.8 wins. The really cool part about the Packers is that the strategy really matches what they're trying to do. And there's one stat that encapsulates that pretty well. So if you look at how often Jordan Love was pressured in under 2.5 seconds, it was under 10%. It was 9.4%. So that's the second lowest rate faced by any quarterback in the National Football League. This is part of why you saw this big leap in his production after week 6. So O-line, but also strategy, everything working together. They don't need a number 1. I'm not getting into that debate, but Jordan Love forecast to have a very good year. In fact, in fantasy terms, he was my number 12 overall quarterback for the season. Next up, the Chicago Bears at 8.6 wins. I love the upside for this team. In fact, they do make the playoffs in a decent enough model. That's at the end. That's in the recap here. And I love the hype for Caleb Williams, but I need some more love for DJ Moore. We need to talk about why this guy is so great. I think you want to look at the next gen stats here. It shows that he caught plus 15.1 receptions over expected last season. That's the second most for any offensive player in the league last year. DJ Moore is your dude. And now you have Rome Odunze too, so lots to be excited about for the Bears. And by the way, DJ Moore has at least 1,100 receiving yards in that magic little 58% of simulations. And the Minnesota Vikings round out the division with 7 wins. Since becoming a Viking in 2020, Justin Jefferson has generated 1,267 receiving yards over expected. He's one of only 2 players to have more than 1,000 such yards in that time period, but Jefferson leads by 266 yards. And by the way, the next closest player is Jamar Chase, and he has 1,001. That is a ridiculous amount. My point is receiving yards over expected means how much better the receiver was than what was expected of him. So even if you don't like Sam Darnold or whatever you want to think about that, you still got to give love to Justin Jefferson, and you still got to realize that this guy will end up with approximately 1,200 receiving yards, and he gets over 1,000 in almost 59% of simulations. To recap the North, the Lions win the division. the Packers make the playoffs, and the Bears end up on the bubble. In fact, they make the playoffs in 14.4% of my simulations. And our last division is the NFC East. It just happened to be the last one. There's no reason why. At 11.2 wins, the Eagles forecast to take the division in my model. And I think we need to celebrate a little bit about how good of a passer Jalen Hurts is. In fact, last season he completed 4.1% more of his passes than expected. That's the third most among qualified passers. So these expected rates are really great because it kind of shows you about an average and where people rank in this average. So third best in terms of expected completion percentage. It's going to be a shift without Jason Kelce, but the Eagles still get it done in my model. The Dallas Cowboys end up with 9.2 wins, finishing second in the East, which means we have yet another year that continues from 2001 where there's no repeat winner in the East. I'm looking at CeeDee Lamb here, and I'm thinking, how could we possibly have any more fun stats about him? But this year could be even better, given that he's likely to get an even higher target share. However, he was the most productive receiver last season against man coverage. I think this is really important. 70 targets, 49 of them were receptions, 794 yards. So that's 132 yards more than any other receiver. So if he gets that man coverage, meaning more likely to be tight coverage, it's still going to be okay. CeeDee Lamb was my number one, or is, I guess, my number one wide receiver for fantasy. I don't think that's surprising to anyone, but this guy also forecast to lead the league in receiving yards per my model. The Washington Commanders come in with 6.4 wins on the heels of their new dynamic rookie quarterback, Jaden Daniels. His projection this season is 3,872 yards, 20 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, 590 rush yards, and 5 rushing touchdowns. Those 5 rushing touchdowns are really fun and interesting, but the thing I like even more is that he forecasts for more than 3,050 passing yards in 67.6% of my simulations. I had to take a beat there because that's really 60. I rarely see that number. So 68% of the time he passes for more than 3,050 yards. Pretty good. The New York Giants round out the division at 5.8 wins. Let's talk about this defensive front that they're figuring out. It certainly is forecast to be the strength of this team. So Kayvon Thibodeau, his season last year, 11.5 sacks, and he's one of 3 players with 15 or more sacks, 5 forced fumbles, and 3 or more fumble recoveries since 2022. Pretty nice. By the way, the other 2 are TJ Watt and Hassan Reddick. Dexter Lawrence has 49 quarterback hits since 2022. That's second most behind just Chris Jones. Now, the newly added Brian Burns gives them even more juice. He has 148 quick quarterback pressures as a Panther since 2019. So those are those under 2.5 second quick pressures. So that's the 4th most in the NFL. That's really good. It's only behind Myles Garrett, Aaron Donald, and TJ Watt. So look for the Giants to be very Giant-like on their defensive line. To recap the East, the Eagles win the division and the conference. In fact, they earn the bye in 9.4% of simulations. To recap the entire conference, we've got Philadelphia, San Francisco, Detroit, Atlanta, Green Bay, Dallas, and the Rams. And by the way, the Bears are just a teeny bit outside looking in. Remember, 14%, it could still happen. My Super Bowl pick, Philadelphia against Kansas City. As of right now, I have Philadelphia narrowly edging out Kansas City in New Orleans, and that's a pretty fun one. By the way, some alternates for who could end up at the Super Bowl that are a little bit more fun, but little less likely to happen. I have a really fun outcome where we get Houston versus San Francisco. That happens in the second most. So if I take Kansas City out and I take Philadelphia out, who are the next closest? It's Houston and it's San Francisco. And then the third most likely combination. So put everyone back in and just said not allowed to be first for the guys who have already been first. And I get a very fun outcome between Kansas City and Detroit. That was a very long first episode, so we're going to cut it right there. But in the future, I'm thinking about some fun stuff where I'm looking at my gut versus what the model says, etc. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want more of. Do you want more numbers? Let me know all of it in the comments. You know how to get a hold of me. Thank you so much for listening along. I can't wait to see what this season brings. And thank you so much. Let's make numbers games so much fun.